welcome. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Author Series event. Many thanks to our strategic partners here at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center for the use of this facility for our public programs. These are filmed for our television show, World Affairs Today, and will be made available on our YouTube channel as well as Facebook, Twitter, and other digital platforms. The United States established diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba in 1902, opening the first embassy in Havana in 1923. Following the rise of Fidel Castro, and in opposition to his nationalization policies, the U.S. Embassy was closed and diplomatic relations were severed in 1961. Later that year, the U.S. support of a failed invasion by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs to overthrow Castro chilled relations further. Poor relations brought the world to the brink of nuclear war in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro, fearing U.S. invasion, agreed to allow the Soviet Union to deploy nuclear missiles on the island. This led to a tense 13-day political and military standoff. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed an agreement with Cuba to establish the U.S. Interest Section in Havana and the Cuban Interest Section in Washington, D.C. In 2014, during the presidency of Barack Obama, diplomatic ties between the two countries were resumed, with the embassy in the United States reopening in Havana and the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. reopening. Efforts were also initiated to ease travel and economic restrictions. However, full normalization of relations between the two countries has yet to be realized. In June 2017, President Donald Trump reinforced and strengthened embargoes against Cuba as part of the National Security Presidential Memorandum. Ambassador Vicki Huddleston's book, Our Woman in Havana, A Diplomat's Chronicle of America's Long Struggle with Castro's Cuba, reviews the past decades of the U.S.-Cuba relationship. Ambassador Huddleston is a career foreign service diplomat with extensive experience both in Latin America and Africa. She began her overseas career in Peru as a Peace Corps volunteer and worked with the American Institute for Free Labor Development in Peru and Brazil. From 1989 to 1993, she was first deputy, then coordinator of the State Department Office of the Coordinator for Cuban Affairs. Ambassador Huddleston was stationed as principal officer of the U.S. Interest Section in Havana from 1999 until 2002. She was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution from 2007 to 2009, where she was also co-director of Brookings Project on U.S. policy towards a Cuba in transition. While at the Brookings Institution, Ambassador Huddleston co-wrote Learning to Salsa, New Steps in U.S.-Cuba Relations. In addition to her work in Latin America, Ambassador Huddleston has vast experiences representing the U.S. in Africa. She served as U.S. Ambassador to Madagascar, Mali, and Acting Ambassador to Ethiopia, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs. She has received multiple U.S. Department of State awards, including a Distinguished Honor Award and the Presidential Meritorious Service Award. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Vicki Huddleston.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for coming out on this terrible evening, and I hope you get home safely. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the Authors Series with the World Affairs Council. And I want to right away, in addition to thanking you for being here, introduce the Honorable Carlos Gutierrez, who was Secretary of Commerce under George W. Bush in his second term. Now, the important thing about Mr. Gutierrez is that he wrote the foreword to Our Woman in Havana. And in addition, he's a Cuban American who initially believed that the embargo and punitive policy was the best approach to Cuba and courageously changed his opinion and now advocates engagement because, if I can speak for you, he believes in private enterprise, and that will help the Cuban people to stand up for themselves and for a new type of government. Carlos? I also see some friends here, a friend from the Peace Corps, Mike Wolfson, Doris Mariani from my AFRICOM days, and I suspect there are other friends that I haven't had a chance to speak with, but thank you very much, all of you, for being here this evening. I started work on Cuba in 1989 as the Deputy Director of Cuban Affairs. Went down to Cuba several times. Of course, I was known to the Cubans and, of course, to Fidel Castro, because if there's one thing the Cuban hierarchy cares about, it's the American officials in Havana and American policy. So when I became Director of Cuban Affairs, I went down with a delegation from the Department of State, from the Africa Bureau, that was celebrating the conclusion of the tripartite agreements in which Cuba removed 50,000 troops from Angola, which is pretty startling. And it's also pretty startling to think that the only foreign country that ever seems to win wars in Africa happens to be Cuba. They fought in both Angola, Namibia, and Ethiopia and Somalia. So we're at this large soiree offered by Fidel Castro at the Palacio de la Revolucion. And as soon as the treaty signing is over, Fidel Castro comes up to our delegation. The delegation leader tries to intercept him, but he looks right at me and he says, who are you? Someone's spouse? Suddenly a hush falls over the entire room. All the glasses stop tinkling, and the diplomats turn around from Namibia, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and they listen for my answer, which I stand up very tall, to 5'4", and say, no, I'm the Director of Cuban Affairs. And so Fidel Castro sort of smiles, and he says, oh, I thought I was. Well, before I can hardly recuperate from this, 2 guards come up and say, follow me, please. And I follow them, and Fidel Castro is standing at the door to the buffet, and he puts out his arm. And I take his arm, and we walk in together. Thank God there were no cell phones in those days, because I would have been looking for a new job the next morning. We then have a long conversation. They push the other diplomats to the other end of the room, and Fidel starts waving his finger at me, saying, el bloqueo, it's killing our children. And I'm saying, no, the embargo is not. You can buy medicines and food from places other than the United States. Finally, in frustration, he turns around, stomps off, and very quickly, a waiter comes up with a tray with a very tall martini and 1 olive. At that point, I go over to the buffet, put down my plate, and pour myself some 100-year-old rum. It seemed that Castro was actually probing to see whether the United States was going to reward him or at least not do anything punitive to Cuba, because after all, Cuba had complied with the tripartite agreements. But that was not to be. George H.W. Bush held off signing into law or endorsing the Cuba Democracy Act, But the Cuban Americans wanted this Cuba Democracy Act that toughened the embargo, essentially making it very difficult for most of Latin America to sell food and medicine to Cuba. So, because the Cuban Americans were absolutely convinced that with losing $5 billion in Soviet subsidies, remember we're talking about 1991, and tightening the US embargo, the Cuban people would rise up and that would be the end of it. So here we are today, how many years later? This often seems to be the case with US policy. We think if we just tighten it a little bit, then somehow the Cuban government's going to fall. On the other hand, it's not all the fault of the United States government. Fidel Castro, and I believe Raul as well, have a limit, not Raul anymore, but initially have a limited interest in seeing the embargo come down because it gives them a scapegoat and it also helps them control information. So Fidel Castro had an opportunity in the second term of President Clinton to help Clinton continue to open up. Because it was Clinton who started the people-to-people, in which you could go down to Cuba on a people-to-people visit for culture, for religion, for education, and other purposeful travel. But Castro didn't wait a minute. When little Elian Gonzalez, anyone remember that, was found floating on an inner tube in the Florida Straits, his 5-year-old child, Fidel Castro saw the opportunity to renew and renovate his revolution because most of the heroes were old. Cienfuegos, Che Guevara, and himself, and Raul, and the old revolutionaries. Here was this young, new face, and here was a cause. The United States, this big Goliath against Cuba, this little David. So Fidel Castro had no hesitation whatsoever to join this fight. And the Cuban American National Foundation had no hesitation whatsoever either. So in Miami, it was war, 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 we're keeping this child. And in Havana, it was marches from Havana Bay down the Malecon, past what was the intersection, now the embassy, waving flags and demanding the return of little Elian. Well, the denouement is that Elian returned. And I remember the ceremony that was right in front of the intersection, now the embassy, which was a big auditorium. And on the seats below were Fidel Castro, his seldom-seen wife, Dalia, the whole Politburo, other than Raul Castro, little Elian, and his father, Juan Miguel. And there I was on the balcony, and if I'd wanted, I could have taken a stone or something else and thrown it. And if I had a good aim, it would have hit Castro. But we are such good enemies, the best of enemies, that I don't think that occurred to the Cubans, and at the time it certainly didn't occur to me. But the waves of that little Elian incident continued to rock both our countries. Fidel Castro, shortly after that, stumbled and fell, and 6 years later, he befell ill and gave up power to his brother Raul. In the United States, the Cuban Americans, who by 30% had supported Clinton, 18% supported Al Gore. They blamed Al Gore for returning little Elian, and they called upon el voto castigo, the punishment vote, which meant certainly helped Al Gore to lose Florida by a margin of 500 votes. And you remember, it went to the Supreme Court, was decided by along partisan lines. So Cuba, and it's to me the most important issue, can determine a presidential election. Because Cuban Americans, less so now, but certainly then, have immense power, not only in their delegation to Washington, but also because they have money and power, and they're absolutely ferocious on this issue of US policy toward Cuba. So, in 1976, it is rumored that Fidel Castro said, "We will have normal relations with the United States when there's a black president and a Latin pope." So in 2013, we had a black president, and with the help of an Argentine pope, Obama and Castro began to craft an opening. Secretary Kerry raised the flag on our intersection that became once again the embassy in August 14, 2015. And in 2016, I believe you might have gone with him, Secretary, Obama and his family went to Cuba. And they visited Havana, and basically the point of this was to show Cubans and Americans that relations needed to be different. We needed to have a different future. And I feel that he brought his children, specifically thinking about the children of Cuba, and that they need a different future than one that is so limited as is the case now. And Obama said he'd like to see reconciliation so that Cubans here and Cubans there would once be a large family and community. But it was not to be. Once again, a presidential candidate, and this is not the first time it happened. In fact, Bill Clinton did the same thing in his first run for the presidency. This candidate, named Donald Trump, went to conservative Cuban Americans and other conservatives and said, I need your vote, I need your support, I need your financing, and I'll support your position. So when he was elected, he came to Florida, to the Cuban American community, and he announced that he was canceling Obama's national security directive to cooperate with the Cuban government. He also said he would change the regulations, and he did so that it would be illegal for Americans to have transactions of any nature with the Cuban military. Fine. But some Cubans, led by Senator Marco Rubio, thought this is not enough. And they were very fortunate because there were these mysterious illnesses that began to harm American and some Canadian diplomats. And at first, no one seemed to know about them. It happened between January and November and January of this year. Some speculated it's the Cuban government. Some speculated that it was a rogue element or that it was the Russians or the Koreans. The Guardian speculated that it was mass hysteria. Now, it seems as if, and this is not official yet, that it may be, according to a University of Michigan study, that listening devices implanted in the homes of diplomats and in the hotel rooms, a couple of hotel rooms, malfunctioned by interfering with another listening device. So without knowing who did it, what did it, or why, the Secretary of State, pushed by Senator Rubio, who pretty much President Trump has handed over foreign policy toward Cuba, insisted on a drawdown of our embassy in Havana. At the same time, he insisted on the drawdown of, in a reciprocal fashion, of the Cuban embassy here in Washington, D.C. So what does this mean now? Cuba is about to go through a transition. For the first time in over a half century, there will no longer be a Castro as president of Cuba. On April 19th, it is expected that the Cuban National Assembly will vote for a new man, and that's expected to be Diaz-Canel, who's a party stalwart and about 57 years old. Fine. So this is a moment when there should be real opportunity for change. Not only that, Raul Castro had begun allowing more private enterprise in Cuba. About 500,000 Cubans are now in the private sector. When the United States pulled down its embassy, then the Cuban government began to roll back the opening. It's much harder now to get an entrepreneurial license. Some are not being renewed. And so Cuba, as is always the case, circles the wagons when the United States threatens. So rather than having this opportunity when there's actually an agent of change going to be the new president of Cuba, Cuba is retreating. And it's because of the U.S. policy toward Cuba at this point. Another, and perhaps more serious issue, is that Cuba has always had a patron. First Spain, of course, then the United States that fought with Cuba to gain independence from Spain, then the Soviet Union, and then when Cuba completely fell on hard times, Venezuela became the source of oil, subsidized oil, and Chavez, the best friend of Fidel Castro. So Cuba needs an ally and a mentor. So who's it going to be now? It looks very much like it's going to be Russia with the help from China. Russia sent a tanker of oil in May. Russia has initialed but not yet signed a deal in which they will take over the operations of the Cienfuegos oil petroleum refinery. And Russia is the source of Cuba's military training and equipment along with China. And China is Cuba's largest trading partner, larger than the European Union. So rather than seeing an opening, we're seeing a retraction in the reforms. We're seeing a movement toward Russia and China. And then what makes me so sad is you see the Cuban people despairing of the situation. We've closed the embassy consular section, so 20,000 Cubans are no longer able to get immigrant visas to join family in the United States. Cubans can no longer travel with any ease. You have to go to Colombia to get a visa, to visit friends, to visit family. When I was there in January, I visited dance groups and choral groups, and I asked some of them, when are you going to the States? And they would just look so discouraged and say, well, we had an invitation, but we had to turn it down. We can't get a visa. Not only that, our public diplomacy is closed. For those of you in the State Department, you know this is very important to do exchanges, to have television talks with people in cultural, artistic, political fields. And most important, we have such a skeleton staff there, I can't see that we can possibly monitor or really understand what is taking place in this momentous change that is occurring in Cuba on the 19th of April. So you might say that we've completely put ourselves in a box as far as a future relationship with Cuba. So before I end, let me tell you one more story. And this story just tears at my heartstrings. So I was driving the official car, which of course I probably shouldn't have been doing, and it was this lovely big black Crown Victoria. And I saw a group of young Cubans looking for a ride along Quinta Avenida. And I stopped and I picked them up, and they all jumped in the car very happily. And we're sitting there for a few minutes, and then someone said, wow, what kind of car is this? And I said, a Crown Victoria, an American car. And they said, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm the head of the United States Diplomatic Service here. And it was very quiet. I thought, well, I hope they don't jump out. And then a young lady says, be our mother. Take us to Miami. If I wasn't convinced before, I was convinced then. How can we leave these Cuban teenagers who are bright, who are well educated, to a fate in which instead of wanting to live in their own country and prosper in their own country, the first thing that comes into their minds is, I want to go to Miami. And I believe so strongly that we have to have a policy that helps those Cuban children want to live and work and prosper in Cuba. And I feel that as long as we have this punitive policy toward Cuba, there will be no space for that change, because the Cuba Communist Party has been there for over 50 years. It's not going to come crashing down. The change will take place gradually over time, and the change will take place more rapidly if we are not threatening Cuba, because as long as we threaten, then the Cuban government has a very good reason to say, no, we're not doing those reforms so fast. We're worried about what's happening in the United States. So just think about it. 6 out of 10 Americans want a policy of engagement. Most Cuban Americans want a policy of engagement. The current policy has failed for over 50 years. We don't need to have an enemy 90 miles off our shore. We need to begin a policy that's going to produce a future for Americans to do business and travel to Cuba, for American national interests so that we don't have Russians and Chinese sitting on our shore, and for the Cuban people. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, Ambassador, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for this opportunity to speak to you. I was born in Venezuela, and I migrated to this country many years ago. I served in the United States Army, and I was assigned to the Southcom, which was operated out of Panama. So I'm quite know about pretty much what was occurring in Cuba. And by the way, Fidel Castro is not a hero. He was a cruel communist dictator. Unfortunately, I think Cuba has created a cancer in the region. And the enemy is not the United States. The enemy is Cuba, because they still want to expand the ideology. Look what they have done in Venezuela. They want to expand to Colombia. The support that they had Cuba with the peace accord with Santos from Colombia and the FARC in Havana, it was an orchestration of Raul Castro. But it was at the same time a way to move the tentacles of Cuba to have the FARC participate in the political arena in Colombia. My question is this: why the United States has been such a poor foreign policy since the 1960s? This nation received nuclear threat 90 miles away from the coast of the United States. And until this day, the United States is very casual about foreign policy towards Latin America.
Thank you for your question. I really appreciate it because I think you stated the opposing view very well. So let me try to tell you why I believe that we have to have a different approach. I sympathize with your point of view that the Cuban government, when it took power, completely overturned the society. Most of Cuba's professionals left. Cuba allied itself with the Soviet Union, and as you referred to, it brought us very close to a nuclear holocaust. You know, in those days, we did things like invade countries we didn't like that did things like that, and then it was finished. Well, we sort of tried that. The failed CIA organized invasion of the Bay of Pigs, but it failed. And once that failed, that meant that the United States was no longer going to overthrow Cuba by force. We might continue to try to assassinate Fidel Castro, and I believe we did so by putting powder in his scuba suit and sending beautiful women down to see if maybe they could slip something into a drink. But we failed. So here's my point. We're not going to overthrow Cuba by force. So if we don't like the government, what is the best approach? And in my view, whether we like the government or don't like the government or are neutral, the best way to deal with Cuba is to empower the Cuban people so that they can decide what they want. Do they want to continue the communist government? Do they want some modifications? Because most Cubans I talk to do appreciate the greater equality in Cuba, the health care, the education in Cuba. They don't like the lack of opportunity, but they do understand they've received benefits. That kind of opening in Cuba only seems to occur when the United States backs off and no longer threatens. That was the case under the second term of Clinton, and for a year and a half under George W. Bush when the people-to-people continued, and we actually had the Cuban Spring of 2002, which you can read about in my book, as you can read most of these stories that I've mentioned. So that's my point. The policy failed, and it continues to fail. If we really want change in Cuba, we need to change our approach to Cuba.
Thank you.
So I grew up most of my life, as maybe the majority of people here, with pretty much isolating Cuba until Obama opened up those relations. And of course, now with the administration, that's kind of up in the air. But I realize that their health may not be the best because they might not have access to health care, maybe not enough nutrition, and possibly education, from what I understand. So I'm wondering if keeping the relations with Cuba, is that gonna help the young people's education? Because I feel like if change is going to happen, that's really got to come from the young education, the young children who are educated. And if they do have that experience of being open-minded with other countries and seeing the way that they live, they might be able to advocate for themselves the democracy rather than us try to enforce that. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about that with the children in education?
I couldn't agree more with much of what you've said. I would add that Cuba's educational system is still very good, as is Cuba's health care. But the really important thing for Cuba is to get communications into Cuba. And that really was beginning to happen under Obama. We had a communications initiative. People are still bringing in televisions, are bringing in radios. And the more access to information Cubans have, the more likely they are going to be able to express themselves, to form groups, to know what's going around the country. As you've probably noticed, I like to tell stories. So I'm going to tell this story about what I did to try to help communications in Cuba. My staff and I, led actually by Peter Corsell, who's up here in the video and in the audience, who was in charge of handing out radios and books. Well, the one thing Castro hated was the radios, because on the radios you can dial up Radio Marti, which he really disliked, because once you got it, you could move around and avoid the jamming. You could get the BBC, you could get VOA, you could get missionary stations, you could get Miami stations. And Cubans love these radios. I mean, this was so important to them to get a hold of these radios. I always remember giving 2 of the radios to 2 young girls I picked up along a dusty road. And one of them kind of started crying, and she said, "Can we have 2 more?" And I said, "Why?" "Well, to give to our brothers who are in prison back in that big gray building." And it was the same with security forces. We once let a box of radios in the road because we had to leave quickly. And some years later, a young lady like yourself stood up and said, "Well, first of all, I want you to know I'm a Cuban American, and my father was in the security services, and he had one of those little radios, and he really loved it." So here's the point. The more we can treat Cuba and Cubans like normal people in other countries. Cuba's the only country in the world in which we maintain a unilateral embargo for about 50 years now. The only way that we can really see change there is when we treat them as we treat other countries in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and around the world. And they're not saddled with this embargo that not only serves as an excuse for anything that goes wrong in Cuba, but actually does deprive the Cuban people of more normal communications, of access to radios, televisions, nobody can get a visa now, and exchanges with the United States that would improve their knowledge as well as our own about medicine, science, etc. So long. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Howard Soros, and I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer from Nigeria. I was in Nigeria in the Yoruba area, which is the source of the Orishas that are the basis of the Santeria religion in Cuba. And I was in Oshobo, which was the town where the shrine for the goddess Oshun was located. So when I went to Cuba the first time, I went. Our people-to-people mission was based on arts, and of course we go to all these art places, and they feature these orishas. And so on the way in, I talked to my guide, who was a young woman who looked like Julia Roberts, nice, very, very nice, pleasant woman. And I said, well, I'm from Nigeria, and I'm from Osogbo, and that's where we had the shrine for Oshun. And she turned to me in aghast, and she said, but Oshun is the patron saint of Cuba. And, with the synchronization with Our Lady of whatever. So that was an interesting thing. And so the second time I went to Cuba, I tried to establish, see how we could establish more of a connection between Africa and the Cuban people there. And I'm interested that you are also from, in Africa a lot, and I wonder if you were trying to establish any of those connections as well. But if I ask a question, I guess I'll say, can you tell us more about the Cuban people's attitude towards the Russians?
Ah, well, interesting question. I'll just say something about the Cuban Babaloos, which are the priests of Santeria. And the Cubans will always tell you that Santeria is not like voodoo in Haiti. They always say, no, it's not the same. Actually, I don't know. I've lived in both Cuba and Haiti. So, I've seen both religions, and I am not an expert anyway, so I can't make a comment on that. But the Cubans say that our religion, Santeria, is a completely peaceful religion. You can't put, hexes on people or anything like that, even if you want to. But I never looked that deeply into it, except that when we had the big battle for Elian, the Babaloos said in their New Year's prediction that if Fidel didn't get little Elian back, he would fall, which even made the Cuban Americans a lot sadder when in fact Elian went back. So to answer your question about the Russians, there's a sympathy, a great sympathy between the Russian military, then the Soviet military, and the Cubans. And I suspect that sympathy extends to the Cuban bureaucracy as well, because they were very close. Cuba was very dependent. And so I think that relationship continues to be a normal relationship because of how long Russia was present in Cuba, essentially from 1961 until 1991. However, in my opinion, and from what I saw, the Cuban people really love Americans. That's their natural affinity, is to Americans and to the United States.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for your heartwarming stories and your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I have more of a comment than a question, if I may. I'm from West Germany, and I guess that is, and I will get to the story of reunification and how it happened and how in a minute, because I really agree with your point of the solution for the Cuban problem, if you like, or to open Cuba up is to do it gradually. I completely agree with you, and to do it in a way to approach the people first, because this is what I experienced in my country, West Germany. Willy Brandt started the policy of rapprochement with the East by just opening the lines of communication and helping them. And so with this rapprochement, he kind of built a basis for what was to come. Of course, Gorbachev had a lot to do with it, but I think Willy Brandt, our former chancellor, he laid the groundwork, and that was exactly what you were saying. A rapprochement, policy of getting to know each other, getting used to each other again, because one has been apart, for so long, especially within when we think of between Cubans and Americans. They have been so apart for so long, they need to get to learn about each other again. And so I fully agree with this vision that you have. A rapprochement is the only way to solve this problem, which is not really a problem because, as you say, Cubans, and I've been in Cuba with my German passport in 2017, and my experience was the Cubans love everything. They love American cars. They love the fact that they can welcome American guests in their private bed and breakfast. So they are open for more contacts. That has been my experience, definitely. And as you also said, my experience has also been they are very happy with their health system and their educational system because they all get it free. They're not happy. They are not happy with the lack of foreign currency. So they are doing everything to make money, especially foreign currency. But they're basically happy with their society. They would just like to have more freedom. That was my observation, and that was just last year. So anyway, I'm getting to my little question. I was admiring the pictures with your dog. I assume it was your dog.
Why the dog?
The question is, what role did he play, and was he your chargé d'affaires, maybe?
But this was politics. And so when you read the book, you will discover the dog was a very important political message that I sent to Fidel Castro. I had bought in Cuba this beautiful Afghan hound. Well, she was a little puppy at one point. And then I discovered through her great trainer, who was a black Cuban, that there were actually dog shows. There's Anna Maria training the dog, who was called Havana, for the dog shows. Well, the dog began to win. And very bad. And in fact, the Cuban Afghan hounds were invited to Mexico. And at first, her trainer thought she was going to get a visa. She got the white card permission. But when she went to get the visa, they said no. Because can you imagine? The champion of Cuba belongs to enemy number one, the American representative. So I got this letter, big surprise in the mail, from Amalia Castro. No idea whether she's a relation or not to the Castros. And the letter says, "You've been given a dishonorable discharge from the Afghan Hound Club." And my staff and I thought this was hilarious. So we called up our backstops at the State Department, and they put a little article in the Loop. Once again, the Americans are in the doghouse. And then, we got a call from NPR. So I said, well, this is how it is. I get out of my house and I walk around, and every house I pass is a guest house because Cubans can't come into this area. And what's more, the Cuban government keeps tight control of the Cuban people and even its foreign diplomats. In other words, we're on a short leash. And it might give you pause. This man bites dog story became so popular. I've seen it in all sorts of little local papers in the United States. It was carried throughout Latin America. It was on Univision. It was on Radio France, all these places, and Fidel was embarrassed because I was trying to tell my story. Look, some changes are needed here as far as the free flow of information. So when an American delegation came to see Castro, the first thing he said to them, "I'm going to give her husband's dog a pardon." So I got a call the next day. You've been slandering us, Ambassador. Well, how's that? We threw you out of the club, not the dog. So Havana was honorably reinstated in the Afghan Hound Club. So since that was one battle I clearly won with Fidel Castro, I include it in the book.
Hi, Ambassador. My name is Evan. I'm about to finish my undergraduate degree, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your beginnings in foreign service and any advice for the next generation that might be interested in joining to fill your footsteps.
Yeah, and then we have a foreign service officer here in the crowd this evening. But just quickly, because I do want to go back to Cuba, but on the other hand, I do love the Foreign Service, and I think it's a great service. And I'd like to say right up front that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, or whether you like the current administration or you don't like the current administration, don't let that affect going into the Foreign Service. Because as Foreign Service officers, we represent our country abroad to the best that we can, and we have a great country. So put that aside. I found it was a marvelous career. I was in the Peace Corps, and then I worked for a while in Latin America, and then I got a master's. Generally, you pass the test with a much better chance if you have a master's, and you have a written and an oral. So you might get through the written, but you probably won't get through the oral if you don't have the master's. And then I went into the Foreign Service. And somehow, you know, after working in Mali and Sierra Leone and working on the Mexican desk, I ended up as the head of our diplomatic mission in Cuba. I like to say this little girl from Hungry Horse, Montana, a town that most people in the world couldn't find if they tried, ended up, you know, representing the United States in Cuba and in other countries. So go for it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ambassador. My name's Kevin. I went to a talk at Center for American Progress a couple days ago on Korea, and one of the speakers talked about a way station, like instead of like a peace treaty or a war, have a way station. If Trump wants to get a peace treaty, can he get one from opening up to Cuba? Maybe Cubans don't take the Cuban mafia and opioids, and we don't take criminals, or thanks.
So what I worry about with the North Korea situation, well, I worry about a lot of things, but Cuba is still fairly friendly with North Korea. I don't think this is a threat to the United States, but I think it could possibly be used by those who don't want to open up to Cuba but want to make the policy harsher still. Because I'd like to say, if you think the policy toward Cuba is harsh now, and by the way, you can still visit, and I know I've been asked about that, so if you want me to tell you how to visit, I will. But we have rolled back a lot of the opening that Obama made, but we can still visit. We still are talking at least about mutual interest in environment and drug trafficking. But if somehow the conservative Cuban Americans can pin Cuba to North Korea, we will go back to the embargo when essentially it was a blockade in, 1962, 1963. So something hopefully we will avoid. Yes.
Hi, Ambassador. My name's Emily. I guess my question is, you talk about this transition that's coming up, and I suppose my question is, do you think that other states will notice, and if so, do you think that is the U.S. key to getting this transition between Raul and whoever else is coming up next, into getting some real change in Cuban international relations? with other states?
That's a great question. Thank you. So, the transition or succession that's coming up. So here's the picture. Cuba is essentially, despite having a president, a parliamentary system. So people elect electors at the local level, who then select at the regional, and then they select a National Assembly, and the National Assembly selects the president of Cuba. So no surprises. I mean, it's sort of like what we saw with Xi Jinping. The National Assembly, or the People's Assembly in China, said, okay, he can stay for life. So there should be no expectations that anything untoward will happen in this essentially succession. But here's the good thing about the succession. For the Cuban people, there's no longer a Castro in charge. That means this is an opportunity for change. They also have seen the reforms that Raul had allowed to be carried out. And that gave them the opportunity to have small businesses, to open restaurants, to have taxi services, to sell souvenirs, to form communication groups. So there really was a great feeling in Cuba of hope that would come during this succession that would further the reforms that were already in place. And so the unfortunate thing is although you will have a new president of Cuba with a name that's not Castro, you're not going to have the reforms moving forward as quickly as you might. In fact, I'm not sure I tell you this in my book, but if I don't, I'll tell you now. When I was in Cuba in January, I was asking people, well, how do you feel about what's going on, about US policy? And they all just looked so discouraged. And they said just one word, Trump. It seems so ironic that the United States should be blamed for everything in Cuba. But you can imagine when the Cubans can't travel to the United States, when now their businesses are suffering because there's not as much, afraid to use the word tourism, visitors from the United States, they do blame the United States, and they do blame the Trump administration.
Ambassador, what are the major reasons or obstacles why United States cannot start providing foreign aid to Cuba and create an ally right there, like they do provide to Egypt and to Israel and other countries?
The main reason, and I thank you for the question, because usually, I think you heard this gentleman at first say, because of, the feeling that the government is a dictatorship, that it doesn't respect human rights. And so we will force a change in Cuba by punishing them until they adopt better human rights and adopt a democracy. Well, certainly for the Foreign Service officers in the crowd, we know that democracy is not an overnight process. One-party systems evolve, like Mexico. It took a long time for Mexico to evolve to a multi-party system. Like the Soviet Union, which still isn't a multi-party system, but it's no longer a communist government per se. Unless you have a revolution and overthrow the government in Cuba, then it's going to be a long process of learning about freedom of speech, responsible speech, democracy, and better human rights. But essentially, that is the excuse that we use and that Cuban Americans always bring up and say, well, we can't have normal relations as long as it's a bad country and does things that are not good on the human rights side. But dare I say that the Saudi prince was just in the White House, and I don't see a lot of difference between human rights in Saudi Arabia and Cuba. In fact, in Cuba, women have a lot more freedom than they do in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, people may have a bit more freedom of speech, but not a lot. Or what about the Philippines, who are now friendly with and their human rights? So I don't think it's a good excuse to say we have this heavy embargo embedded in 4 laws and preventions from and we prevent Americans from traveling freely because they don't have the kind of human rights and democracy we approve of. Anyway, I don't think we should approve of other people's human rights. Thank you.
You talk about personalities of the Castro, but now when we're talking about his successor, you probably know everybody's talking about Miguel Diaz-Canel. You probably met him personally. What are your impressions of him in different levels? And also, what role in political and social life in contemporary Cuba playing Mariela Castro? She, as far as I know, she's a very well-known LGBT activist and something like that.
Yeah, well, I don't know Diaz-Canel. It seems to me that he's a very solid, responsible, reliable party bureaucrat. But he lacks all the revolutionary credentials. So it isn't like, I'm the revolution. That's what that's what Raul could say. Suddenly, the revolution is in the hands of people who weren't part of the revolution initially, that weren't in the Sierra Maestra with Raul and with Fidel. So this means a new generation is taking hold, even if they're good cadre, political cadre, it still means that's a big generational difference. 57 as compared to 85, 86, I think Raul is right now. So I think just the idea that we're having a succession with a new name should provide an enormous opportunity for more freedoms in Cuba. But I don't see that happening right now because, as I say, the Cubans are worried about the position of the United States.
And what about Mariela Castro?
Mariela, yeah. I have to tell you a little story about Mariela. Yes, this is Raul Castro's daughter, who's always been a real feminist, and way back when I was there in the 2000, she was well known for advocating for gender rights. And I had been to to Jimmy Carter's speech. Jimmy Carter went to Havana after he had left the presidency. He gave this great speech, and he advocated for Project Varela, which was an effort to change the Cuban constitution. And the human rights activists who did this petition had gotten 30,000 signatures. And Jimmy Carter very bravely stood there with the whole Politburo in the front row, just like here, and advocated for this project. So after it was over, I was walking back down the road, and suddenly this little white Lada, which all the government personnel ride in, stopped, and out runs the foreign minister. It was Felipe Roque at that time. Ambassador, ambassador, because they called me ambassador since I had been ambassador in Africa. How are you? ¿Cómo estás? Blah, blah, blah. I couldn't figure out what was going on until he said, Mariela needs a visa. Because she wanted to go to a gender conference in San Francisco. I said, well, I'll do what I can. And Mariela got the visa. There was no complaint. And I remember just about a year ago, she applied and she was turned down. Anyway, some people have mentioned her as a possible successor to her father, yet another Castro, but I doubt it. I mean, it looks pretty solid for Diaz-Canel right now. She said the Star Wars, the sonic injuries were Star Wars. So she stays tuned in to the political situation.
Are there any other questions?
Did anybody want to know about whether, well, let me just say, I was asked early on in the cocktail about going to Cuba. Yes, you can still go to Cuba under the people-to-people, but it's safest if you go with like travel arrangements abroad, academic travels, things like that, because they have a license. But that's expensive. So if you're really determined to go, then you have to have a valid reason. You have to be going to study, have to be going for cultural reasons, and you have to keep track of it. Like you have to stay in a Airbnb that's run by Cubans, visit restaurants that are run by Cubans, visit museums and art affairs, and there's musical events all the time, and document that to prove that you're there on a people-to-people. Because there are 5 laws that govern our embargo with Cuba. And when the Congress in 2000 passed an agricultural bill that allowed us to sell agricultural products to Cuba, so we're a big, used to be, it's cut back now, agricultural supplier to Cuba. In return, there was a provision put in that said no tourism to Cuba. So even if Obama wanted, and he probably did want to say, okay, let's have freedom of travel, he could not, because it's part of US law that there can be no tourism. So you have to be in one of these categories of travel to go to Cuba. Unless you stand up and begin to demand a change of policy, because that's what the American people want. That's what the Cuban American people in the majority would like, and that's what would be best for our national interest.
Ambassador Huddleston, thank you so much for sharing your time and experience with us this evening. Please join me in thanking her again.
And thank you all. Thank you.